Big round of applause. Dr. Shashi Tharoor on the stage. And in conversation with Monideepa Banerjee, Monideepa Banerjee রয়েছেন আমাদের সকলের জন্য একবার আপনাদের কাছ থেকে জোরে করতালি চেয়ে নেব। অপেক্ষার অবসান। Now I would ask the moderator to start the program.
Thank you for waiting for Mr. Shashi Tharoor. I'm absolutely confident the wait will be worth every second that you've sat here and listened to this wonderful Baul music. Mr. Shashi Tharoor really needs no further introduction, but I think today I must add just one little line that about 15 years ago, this MP from Thiruvananthapuram, he wasn't the MP then, almost became the UN General Secretary. And that puts him in a very special position to answer the question that has been raised over here today. And that is the world disorder. Is India going to make it much more stable than it is? Thank you for being here. Thank you, Kolkata Literature Festival, for the privilege of being able to speak to Mr. Tharoor. Let's go straight to the headlines, as it were. Is the world in disorder in the first place? I mean, think of the world wars that we have been through. Okay, so Ukraine and Russia are fighting and Gaza is going up in flames, but is this disorder or is this business as usual?
No, it is disorder, because to talk about disorder, we have to understand what order was supposed to be. And the order was supposed to be what was established in the world at the end of the Second World War, when after a half century that had been characterized by 2 world wars, countless civil wars, mass displacements of population, and the horrors of the Holocaust and Hiroshima. The world statesmen got together and said, never again, we've got to do something about this. And they wrote up the new international order. They created the United Nations, wrote a charter for it. They created the Bretton Woods institutions, the World Bank and the IMF, to reconstruct and develop the poorer countries. They did all of this and said, now we will have a long era of peace. In fact, it wasn't entirely a long era of peace, because a lot of conflicts were pushed to the periphery.
Absolutely.
So the developing world still had wars and conflicts. But there no longer was a third world war, which everyone was fearing after the first two.
That's
and
true.
we were able to have a situation in which, mercifully, you actually had peace, development, the onset of progress, literacy, decolonization. All of these things happened over a period of time. And it was called, for lack of a better term, the new liberal international world order.
True.
And that was supposed to be the system. Now, a number of things happened. There was a Cold War, but there was an equilibrium between the two superpowers, and
Correct.
somehow the United Nations managed to navigate a way between them. For example, inventing the concept of peacekeeping by
Correct.
using the military strengths of the middle and smaller powers, rather than those of the big powers as envisaged by the Charter. Then came the end of the Cold War and what was called briefly the unipolar moment, when the US was the dominant. But even then, the world was more or less calm at the macro level. The big powers all agreed. The Russians were on the same page as the Americans on most issues. But what you did see was indeed the eruption of smaller conflicts within countries that didn't have much of an impact on their neighbors. So you had, civil wars in places like Georgia, in places like the Yugoslav Civil War was a major one, because it created 5 countries at the end of it. But all of that happened, but that was still localized disorder. What we are seeing now, first with the American invasion of Iraq, which is a permanent member of the UN Security Council, going ahead and attacking a country without the Security Council sanction. Now you have Russia attacking a member state, Ukraine, without the Security Council's approval. And both those countries, of course, having a veto in the Security Council, no one can do anything about them. Meanwhile, we're seeing the eruption of a horrendous conflict in Gaza. And the result now is a perception that things are spinning out of control, because the world order that was established in 1945 is not able to curb any of it. You've got, for example, now the US imposing sanctions on Russia. That makes it very difficult for many countries to conduct normal trade.
Absolutely.
That's affected other kinds of trade relations. The Ukraine war also dramatically affected commodity prices, created a debt crisis in countries as far apart as Sri Lanka and Bolivia. So you're seeing a lot of countries feeling destabilized by the developments of the last couple of years. I think we certainly can call it a world disorder.
So we are a disordered world. Mr. Tharoor agrees with that. But India's role in stabilizing it, how do you see it? All I can say is that when we were young, we heard about NAM and SARC, and now we hear about Quad and SCO, and there are two other words that have been added to the dictionary: Vishwaguru and Vishwamitra. So what are we, the world's greatest teacher and the world's biggest friend?
That actually is a slightly embarrassing kind of coinage. Going around calling yourself the teacher of the world is not the most subtle or impressive thing you can do, because ultimately you have to let others hail what you are contributing and not the other way around. But I don't think, frankly, that especially given our domestic situation, that anything we're doing is going to actually inspire the rest of the world as an example of the work of a world teacher, Vishwaguru. But yes, the world being in disorder has also shaken some of the assumptions of our foreign policy. We are still non-aligned, we're a member of the non-aligned movement, but what does that mean anymore is not very clear, because the two superpowers are no longer the US and the Soviet Union. They are the US and increasingly China, which is perhaps arguably already a superpower, but if not, is very close to proclaiming itself as one. It has the capacity to influence events half a globe away, which is the definition of a superpower. Now that situation is not one we can be truly non-aligned between, because China is sitting on our frontiers and nibbling away at our territory, or at least a territory that we used to have access to. There was an undefined frontier which both armies would patrol, and now in 26 of the 65 points along that frontier, we are no longer able to access places which we used to patrol before June of 2020, and the Chinese have killed 20 of our soldiers there. So difficult for us to be totally neutral. So on that one, as you said rightly, we have partnered with the US, Australia and Japan in the Quad, and that means that we're not totally neutral on the sword, non-aligned in the existential sense, perhaps, in that we don't have any allies. We haven't surrendered to the alliance requirements that in, for example, a NATO alliance. If one of the NATO members is attacked, all the others are bound by treaty to also fight and defend that country. We don't have any alliance like that. But we do have a partnership that counts. Similarly, we are in fact in a situation in which we are seen by the Chinese as more aligned with their enemies or with those countries trying to contain them than historically we used to be. So that's one complicated development. The second one is that even in the Middle East, for example, after the so-called Abraham Accords, and also for, I think, other reasons to do with the ruling party's policies in this country, India has become much closer to Israel than it was in the past. And in this closeness is manifested in a couple of ways. One is very strong bilateral relations. Mr. Modi became the first Indian Prime Minister to go to Israel. Mr. Netanyahu has come twice. There are reports in the Western press, unverified because unverifiable in India, that the Israelis have even sold Mr. Modi's surveillance equipment that is being used against opposition leaders in this country. I seem to have been, yes, indeed. So maybe they're hearing this while we're going on, because my phone is sitting in front of me. But anyway, all of that, plus on the international side, we are a member of a new grouping called the I2U2, which is India, Israel, the UAE, and the US. Now, I don't know what the future of I2U2 is in the aftermath of the Gaza conflict, but initially, at any rate, India was far more sympathetic to Israel than its traditional position had been. And you certainly saw a dissonance between the Prime Minister's tweets, which were very much on one side of the issue, and the somewhat more hesitant tweets by the, I mean, not tweets, but statements by the Ministry of External Affairs, which was saying, reiterating India's traditional position, defending Palestinian rights, and the need for two states to be established that would live side by side in peace and security, at a time when Israel is saying that they will not agree anymore to a Palestinian state. So that's another situation where our position is slightly more questionable. I would say that India is also going through a state of flux. But rather than Vishwa, what's interesting is that Mr. Modi has tried to position India as the voice of the global south.
Exactly.
Now that is a kind of updated version of the non-aligned movement, if you like, the voice of the developing countries. We had two bodies that played that role, the non-aligned movement and the so-called G77, which was the global trade union of developing countries. The voice of the global south subsumes both ideas. But on Israel, for example, in our first vote of the General Assembly, when we voted against a resolution, we voted to abstain on a resolution for peace. In other words, the land of Mahatma Gandhi didn't support peace. That put us in a very odd position because we were on the one hand saying we were the voice of the global south, but we were completely isolated from the rest of the global south, and indeed even some countries in the global north that had voted for a humanitarian truce.
Correct.
Even France, for example, which is historically an ally of Israel, voted for that truce and India abstained. So all of these suggest that even India's position is not entirely certain, is evolving would be the polite way to put it. And I think we will have to see where we end up on these issues. If China were to take a more directly belligerent posture, there is every likelihood that, hard choices may have to be made by India.
Is there a danger, perhaps with China, perhaps taking a harder position? Is there a danger that India is going to be pushed into a position when it is a US pawn?
But that's something we have obviously been resistant to. And I think in all fairness, that's one step too far. Every government in India, from independence onwards, has been wedded to the idea of strategic autonomy. What is strategic autonomy? It's a sense that, frankly, after 200 years of a foreign country deciding what India's position was in the outside world, when the English cricketer C.B. Fry led the Indian delegation to the League of Nations and so on, after all of that, the one thing we wanted after independence was not to be tied down to any other country's perspective on the world. We wanted the right to decide for ourselves on the merits of every issue. In fact, there's a probably apocryphal story that John Foster Dulles, President Eisenhower's Secretary of State, allegedly said to Nehru in a phrase that we've heard in more recent years as well, "Are you with us or against us?" And Nehru is said to have replied, "Yes." So we're with you when we agree with you. We are against you when we don't agree with you. It's entirely up to us to decide. That is the kind of idea of strategic autonomy, that we will decide ourselves what we want to do. And I think that is going to strongly limit how far we will go in the direction that you're afraid of. But we can certainly tilt a long way. I mean, there's no question that when we signed that 20-year treaty of peace, friendship, and cooperation with the Soviet Union, the world perceived us as having tilted to the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And similarly, a lot of the agreements we're signing now will give the world the perception that we are tilting towards the US, even if we profess to be non-aligned.
Fascinating. Watch it. Are we going left or right or sticking to the center? Since we are talking about new words that are, entering our foreign policy and all our, vocabulary, I want to ask you about Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam.
That's not so new. That's a rather old phrase.
No, but the way it's being put to use by this present government, is it good for stability? I'm just concerned about the fact that today India seems to be losing control of its relationships, even in the neighborhood. I mean, just 2 days ago, we had talk about that plane crash landing in Mizoram because Myanmarese soldiers are streaming in. That border is getting more disturbed, and India's relationship with the junta continues to be open to question, at least in my book.
Yeah.
And then there is, do I even need to tell you? Whatever happened with Maldives? I mean, we are losing friends faster than we can say Jack Rabbit or Robinson. So when we are not in control of our own neighborhood, can we actually be getting stability into the world?
But Mandir, I think in all fairness, is the Maldives relationship India's fault, or is it something to do with the Maldives? Historically, small countries with very big neighbors have often had a chip on the shoulder. The old Mexican president Porfirio Diaz famously said a century ago, more than a century ago, he said, "My poor Mexico, so far from God and so close to the United States." You know, you can imagine somebody in Maldives saying the equivalent of that about the relationship with India. We are very big. I mean, Maldives is not even the size of a small Indian town. It's 5 lakh people.
Absolutely.
And how can
I think there are more people in this book fair.
Yeah,
today
probably, yes. I heard that
the
the footfall in the book fair is a couple of lakhs already.
Yeah.
So, I mean, in this kind of situation, you can imagine there will be one set of people who want and value good relations with India, and another set of people who feel that somehow their pride requires them to be hostile to India. We had a similar situation in Bangladesh not long ago.
Yeah.
So I would say that unless you want us to directly influence the politics of a neighboring country, which perhaps we could have done, I don't know, but we didn't try. The fact is that the Maldives have elected a government right now that's hostile to us. The previous government was friendly to us. The one before that was also hostile to us.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, you know, you have to see it in the context of their own policies. And I must say, one of the things that you all should appreciate is that gratitude doesn't go very far in international affairs.
Absolutely.
Whatever you do for the Maldives, we've put down a coup against their government. When they had only one sort of water treatment plant which broke down, and we sent plane loads of bottles of water so that the Maldivians could actually have water to drink.
Yeah.
We've done all of that. And so you might think that, you know, they'd be grateful, but that never happened. That never counts for very much. So on this one, I'm not going to blame the government, but perhaps some other things could have been done to handle this more adroitly. At the moment, you're right. Our periphery is not in good shape. We have awkward relations with Maldives. Things with Sri Lanka are not too bad. They've been worse in the past.
Correct.
And things with Bangladesh are pretty good, but at a price, because Bangladesh is, unfortunately, its credibility because of the opposition Mukt elections has not been particularly appreciated around the world.
When did
But
we last have a
China-
conversation with Pakistan? I
Yeah,
can't
so
even remember.
Pakistan is in bad. Nepal is more and more subject to Chinese influence. Chinese influence also increasing in Bhutan, which is also nibbled away at the Doklam Peninsula and is taking large chunks of Bhutanese territory, and we can't do anything about it. So on the whole, we're not doing very well in the border areas, but not all of it is India's fault. And I think it's important that, at least on foreign policy, we look at national interest first, whether or not the government respects the opposition's right to have a view on these matters. That is my view.
I know that we are being kind of very examining the foreign policy of this this government of 10 years now very closely in the last few minutes. But tell me, have they been able to replace the Nehruvian view with something substantial?
No, but even Vasudeva Kutumbakam used to be quoted by Nehruji as well. I mean, the fact is, it's been part of, if you like, the bromides of Indian foreign policy, that we are very much, the world is one family, and we come from this ancient, peace-loving civilization, the land of Emperor Ashoka and Mahatma Gandhi and all of that. And to be honest, these kinds of things have a certain value for presentational purposes. Whether they actually define how we really behave in the world is a different question altogether. I will say, though, that my own impression of the way in which the world is that we will be judged much more by the strength of our democracy at home, which frankly is being questioned all the time. One of the things that truly depresses me is a lot of Indians actually think that India's standing in the world has gone up under this government. Well, you just go and pick up any newspaper in any Western democracy, in the US, in UK, in France, Germany, whatever, and all you find about Indian democracy is negative writing about how minorities are mistreated, the opposition is harassed, the free press is curtailed, people's rights are being restrained. The Swedish prestigious institute called the Varieties of Democracy Institute, VDEM, which issues an annual classification of democracies, downgraded us last year
They call
from a
us
democracy.
an electoral autocracy.
Electoral autocracy. So we elect a government freely, but then that government conducts itself like an autocracy. This is not good, and frankly, the kind of credibility we enjoyed because we were a democracy, and that to a democracy which enshrined values of diversity and pluralism, in a land where, I mean, I remember traveling for the United Nations in the Islamic Gulf countries in 2004 when the election results came out and the new government was formed. And you know, the ministers and the senior officials I met were just over themselves with astonishment that in our country, an election had been won by a party led by a woman political leader born in Italy and of Roman Catholic faith, who then made way for a Sikh gentleman to be sworn in as Prime Minister by a Muslim president in a country 80% Hindu. And they were just astonished. I said, how can this happen? And I said, we're not trying to impress you, this is who we are. Today, this is no longer who we are, and that is a very sad thing. You know, we have a government which for the first time since independence, a ruling party has no Muslim MP, no Muslim minister, and it's something that in many ways I don't think sells very well outside. And all these other factors about the way in which a democracy is being conducted. So that is what accounts for India's relatively poor image outside. We are now being treated like an Indian equivalent of Trump or Bolsonaro or Erdogan or whatever.
That's not nice.
That's the kind of leadership we have in the eyes of the world, which is a great pity. And I would say that if we want to be a Vishwaguru, then we need to set an example at home first.
True. But there's one world event that I thought drew mixed reactions from India, and that was the Ukraine-Russia situation. I don't know what to call it, still invasion, war, or whatever. But I remember Mr. Modi was very firmly quiet on Ukraine and very vocal in supporting Russia. At that time, the country was divided, that, why are we supporting an aggressor? But somehow that situation has been controlled by Mr.
Well,
Modi.
in the parliamentary debate, I was the only one who actually criticized the government openly. I said that, for principles we have stood by ever since independence, were not even mentioned in our first couple of statements at the United Nations. The inviolability of borders, the sovereignty of states, the inviolability of the UN Charter, the inadmissibility of the use of force to settle disputes. These are all the classic principles India has always stood up for in world affairs. And we were not doing it anymore, and I was disappointed. Subsequently, we have started alluding to them, but we still haven't called out Russia by name. We still haven't called it an invasion. We still haven't called it a violation of Ukraine's sovereignty. So we've fallen a long way short of the standards that we should apply to friends. Now, the argument uses, but our interests demand it. And certainly the ability of India to have managed to purchase Russian oil and gas without attracting Western sanctions or opprobrium, that is to the credit of our very skilled professional diplomats. No question about that. But at the same time, our inability to tell a friendly state, if that's what Russia still is, despite its increasing dependence on China, if we are unable to tell them when they're doing something wrong, then it seems to me that that friendship is a bit one-sided. I mean, let's face it, we buy weapons and spare parts from Russia, but we pay top dollar. We don't have to feel that it's a one-sided dependence on them.
A quick question, and that is, we are going to be winding up shortly. A question on G20. You have praised the way it was held in Delhi and said that they did a good job coming out with a communique. But at the same time, what happened immediately after? We had the Canadian Prime Minister leave the country in a huff over the issue of terrorists being allegedly killed by Indian operatives in Canada. And then we had the United States also backing that claim in a way, and apparently a gentleman was threatened in the US. And what does that say?
So, I mean, there are two aspects here. First, I don't blame the government for its irritation with Canada, because there is no doubt that in the name of free speech, the Canadians have given free rein to some extremely dangerous and malicious elements who have been fomenting violence and killings in India. So to that degree, the fact that Canada says it's their free speech right, we are a democracy, you can't tell us, etc., that, on the other hand, I believe, whether we were in power or the BJP was in power, we would have been equally critical that there has to be some limits. And there is a difference between free speech on the one hand and incitement to violence in a foreign country on the other. Having said that, if, as is being alleged, and perhaps the circumstantial evidence is rather damaging anyway, suggesting that India did order assassinations, one successful in Canada, one unsuccessful in the US, then that was extremely poor judgment to begin with. And secondly, it was done very ineptly, because obviously the American thing, even the Canadian thing apparently was traceable to us, and the American thing, there's going to be a court trial, which is going to bring out very embarrassing public details that will tarnish our image in the world again. So both of these were highly avoidable. It is one thing to apply such techniques to a country like Pakistan, which does the same and worse to us and to Afghanistan and to others. That I think the world will understand that it's an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. But the Americans and Canadians are not going around conducting officially sanctioned assassinations on Indian soil, and it would therefore, unfortunately, not do us very much good. Now, it so happens that we are very useful to the same countries. The US needs India as a potential counterbalance to China, or at least as a sympathizer in its efforts to resist the irresistible rise of China. And the Canadians, whether we like it or not, eventually still are a country hosting 4 million Indians, and they have the largest student body in Canada happens to be Indians. There's a lot of other reasons to connect the two countries. So at the end of the day, both relationships will not suffer, it seems to me, permanent setbacks. But nonetheless, we're going to go through a period of great embarrassment, especially when in a public trial in New York, all these details of the attempted assassination come out. It's going to not look very good for us.
From what you say, it doesn't look like India is going to turn troubleshooter across the world anytime soon. Mr. Tharoor, I have Sujata waving to me frantically from
No, we can carry
that
on,
side.
I think, because we've got some more time, and if there are
I
questions
have
from the audience.
multiple questions, but yeah, I would like to open the floor to questions. Please give us your name and make the questions like short. Now, I'm a television person, I live by the second, so about 15 seconds for a question. Whoever is going first.
I think you'll have to pick them because the mic has to go to somebody.
Yes, sure, I'll give you another 5 seconds for that. But really short and quick questions.
How would you comment on the current Ram Mandir inauguration?
That's a question I didn't ask.
No, look,
Thank
I
you.
already have commented on it, which is that, I am certainly not going to relinquish Ram to the BJP. I go to temples too and I pray as well. I don't think the BJP has any monopoly on any form of divinity. But I would also insist that I don't go to temples or political events, and this was very much a stage-managed political event at which the opposition MPs were invited essentially to play bit parts or supportive roles in a prime ministerial starring spectacular. So I think we'll wait for all the political madness to die down, the elections be over, and then as individuals, those of us who have faith will go, others have faith in other faiths, and we respect all faiths. We would welcome people continuing to practice their own faith themselves, but not use religion for political purposes.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
I think if you come and stand for an election in Kolkata city, definitely you're going to win. Next question.
Yeah.
15 seconds question, that's
Sure.
it. I'm only entertaining 10-second questions. Go ahead.
Good evening, sir. So, Dr. Tharoor, I would like to ask you one question. You have already been a key, member of the Parliament as well as Minister for the HRD and also for the External Affairs. So, do you think that there should be a sync between the HRD and the MEA ministry in order to make India the solution for the disorders that is happening in the world?
That's an interesting idea. I mean, I think that if you're suggesting that there should be greater emphasis placed on the study of international relations and world affairs, I certainly don't disagree. Whether the ministry should be dictating that or the public should be dictating is another matter. To that degree, I would rather that universities were freed from ministerial or governmental control and that they could set their own syllabuses. I might add that I personally have encouraged at least 2 universities that I know personally to start schools of international affairs, and there is a demand for their courses. And these are Symbiosis and Jindal. And I must say that in both cases, they've been telling me there's a very good response from students. There is a curiosity amongst young Indians about studying about the world, and we should encourage that.
Lovely. Question 3. Sujata Di, we have time? Yeah. Okay, third question. Who has the mic? Whoever has the mic. Have mic, ask question.
Dr. Tharoor, your books are actually an encyclopedia of knowledge through which we go over and over again. When are you releasing your next book? Eagerly awaiting for that.
The next one is coming out this year, I think probably in the first half of the year. It's gone to bed, as it were, but not yet to press. It's a book called Shashi Tharoor's Wonderland of Words, and it's about words and language and and all of the stuff that you all seem to expect me to have views on. So I'm giving you my views. The subtitle is Around the Word in 100 Essays. It's 100 short essays about words and language.
Wonderful, lovely. We can look forward to that. Next question, 10 seconds.
Good to see you, Dr. Tharoor. I'm a great fan. I study history in Presidency University.
Oh, great. Thanks.
I want to ask you, you already mentioned Bolsonaro and Erdogan in Turkey. So do you concede that there is a takeover of the right wing in the world? And also there's Trump in Russia, Marine Le Pen was contesting in France. So is there a right wing taking over the world?
There is a definite backlash against the liberalism, cosmopolitanism, and so on of the globalization era. In the last 10, 15 years, we've been seeing a constant move towards deglobalization, which was accelerated by the COVID pandemic. And I think we have seen, as you rightly said, the rise of a kind of hyper-nationalist, anti-cosmopolitan group of people who are rooted in their own cultures, in their own languages, in their own religions. Erdogan in Islam, Trump in Christianity, and so on. And I might add that this is actually something which we've been hearing. There's a British author called David Goodhart who divides the world into somewheres and anywheres. And he says the anywheres are people who are comfortable in any country in the world, flit from five-star hotel to business class lounge, attend international conferences like Davos. That's the anywheres. But the somewheres are those who are focused in one locality, one country, one religion, one language. And they, he suggested, are winning. Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister of Britain, famously said, anyone who considers himself a citizen of the world hasn't understood the first thing of what citizenship really is about. So you've got this kind of pushback from the right. But at the same time, it is not a uniform story of success. Bolsonaro lost the election. Trump lost an election. He may come back, but he did lose an election. Marine Le Pen came second twice, right? So you're not looking at a uniform success story for the right. Erdogan, yes, has succeeded time and time again. Now suddenly in the Netherlands, Geert Wilders was the largest single party. But in many other countries, though they become a potent force and they influence their country's politics, they're not necessarily in power. And we hope in 2024, the voters of India will also ensure that we are not on that list anymore.
Next, who has the mic? Go ahead, 10 seconds.
Hello, sir. My name is Rana Mitra. We read your book on that, why I'm a Hindu, and then the brilliant era of darkness, where you kind of presented the philosophical thing. The latest one is more of a biographical one that you came out with. So the one book you talked about that's going to come, the next, are we going to go into the philosophical mode, which we are more of a big fan of, rather than the biographical one?
Philosophical mode.
Sorry, what is it that you're a big fan of, rather than biography?
The philosophical ones, like...
Well, I'm very proud of a book I wrote, which unfortunately was released during COVID, and so it sank without trace. It's called The Battle of Belonging, and the subtitle is On Nationalism, Patriotism, and What It Means to be an Indian. I'm very proud of that book. It is a philosophical book in that the first 100 pages study the entire concept of nationalism, describe what it is worldwide and how it should apply in most contexts over the last 100, 150 years. Then I talk about the Indian nationalism, which evolved from an anti-colonial nationalism into something that is called civic nationalism. There is a nationalism that is anchored in a constitution and institutions, rather than ethno-religious nationalism, which is anchored in identity politics. Now, what we are seeing in India, I argue, is an attempt by the Hindutva forces to change the nature of India's nationalism from civic nationalism to ethno-religious nationalism. At the same time, they've been arrogating some of the language of patriotism, and I try and draw a clear distinction between patriotism and nationalism. Patriotism is love of country the way you love your mother. Right? It's not because she's the most beautiful woman in the neighborhood or the most brilliant scholar in the department or whatever. She's your mother, you belong to her, she belongs to you. That's love, that's patriotism, that's what you feel as a patriot. A nationalist, on the other hand, is attached to symbols of the state, the army. It's often an aggressive, assertive force that's directed against others. And I have a sentence in which I say, a patriot is prepared to die for his country, but a nationalist is prepared to kill for his state. That's the big difference, and that's why Tagore, for example, wrote so critically about nationalism. So please read that book if you're interested in philosophy, because there are very important ideas there that I feel very sorry haven't got the readership they deserve. The Battle of Belonging. Thank you.
Who has the mic now?
There's a lady there.
Okay.
Sir, obviously you're my political idol. As you can see, I've been representing you in youth parliaments.
Thank you.
Sir, my question is, in light of Russia's intending new energy policies tending towards China and India, and them saying that they are not friends against anyone else's friends, do you think enough diplomatic attempts can be made to foster such cooperation between India and China? So perhaps we can have a China-India-Russia bloc, at least by economic motives.
Well, I'm not sure that's entirely realistic, because the problem is our problems with China are not initiated by us. These are problems resulting from China's assertiveness and hostility towards us. There already is a grouping called RIC, the Russia, India, China Trilateral, which the foreign ministers meet every year. And there used to be summits as well, though for some time now, the Chinese hostility has prevented that. And of course, Mr. Putin's inability to travel very easily has also become a problem. I would say, frankly, that if I had a choice, that is not a partnership that I would be very keen on, because it will actually compromise our image in 90% of the world. This is not a particularly welcome set of partners. Having said that, I appreciate the fact that every Indian government wishes to keep viable relations with everybody. We don't want to create any permanent enemies. And this old line, a 19th century line, that a nation has no permanent friends and no permanent enemies, it only has permanent interests, still remains broadly true. At least for us, we don't want to create, that's why that whole non-aligned strategic autonomy business is still in our minds. Having said that, I will say that you might want to look at my co-authored book, The New World Disorder and the Indian Imperative, which I wrote with Samir Saran, who heads the Observer Research Foundation. What we talk about is some of the serious crises affecting world order. Crisis of legitimacy, the crisis of sovereignty, the crisis of the collective. And we try and explain how India can play a more constructive role. Unfortunately, by the time that book was written, India had begun turning domestically in a direction that makes it very difficult for me to express any optimism about India being a great example to the world. But I do think that we're better off not locking ourselves into either RIC or even for that matter into a US or Western sort of alliance, but keeping up good relations across the board. Our partnership with France, which got a new boost yesterday, is a very interesting example of a country which is in the Western camp and yet asserts its independence from time to time. And we can find some affinity with that kind of approach, where we have our own independent view on things, but we have a partner that looks at the world much the same way. So here are things we can develop, and at the same time try not to provoke a war with China. But my worry is the Chinese may not need provocation. They may decide to teach India a lesson once again, as they did in '62.
Can I get in a question here? I know there are more questions, but since you brought up our friendship with France and the fact that Mr. Macron was here yesterday, what I want to ask you is, there is a section of, the media, people like me, I guess, who are looking at the possibility that Mr. Biden rejected our invitation to come to the Republic Day parade, but India used its very strong connections with France to replace him with the French president. And Mr. Biden rejected our invite because of this whole
case in New York, for one thing.
Yes.
And also, I think the consciousness that this was bound to be used in a domestic election campaign here, and it might have consequences for his domestic election there. So he may well be willing to come if he gets re-elected, and if Mr. Modi gets re-elected, the invitation could be renewed next year. That's not a problem. Of course, we don't intend to see Mr. Modi re-elected, but that's another matter.
But you are saying that it is a possibility, a factor.
Yeah, and I think it's to India's credit that we had such a major country as France available as a last-minute substitute.
It's a huge sign.
It shows that there is enough interest in France in the relationship with India, and in India in the relationship with France, that we were able to do this even when the Biden cancellation came very late in the day.
Actually, that's a sign of foreign policy power.
Yeah.
Last question, one question.
Whoever has the mic.
Sir,
Whoever has the mic, yeah.
hello. I'm Kirit Popat. Sir, what are your views on the prospects of India bloc in the coming elections?
Of India, the India bloc.
India bloc, yes.
2024.
Look, I believe that it's almost inevitable that the BJP will lose seats from last time, because they did so well in 2019 in a number of states that there's no way they can go but down. You may remember last time they won every seat in Haryana, every seat in Rajasthan, every seat in Gujarat, all but one seat in Madhya Pradesh, all but one seat in Bihar, 18 seats in Bengal, all of which are impossible to replicate. Even if it's only a handful of seats, they're going to lose in all these states. And they're going to lose seats in Karnataka, for example. They're going to lose seats in Maharashtra, where the MVA alliance is much stronger now, and Shiv Sena is no longer with them. And until the last couple of days, when Mr. Nitish Kumar's intentions became somewhat unclear, I was going to say they would lose seats in Bihar also. So I'm just saying that across the board, there is a very strong likelihood the BJP will drop. The question for the India alliance is how much can we drop them to? Because if they drop to between 250 and 270, we know they can form a government anyway. They'll just get one of the regional parties to ensure that they don't vote against this government. If we drop them below that, 240, 230, it seems to me it's game over for the BJP government as we now know it. Also willing still to support an India alliance government in Delhi. We've seen this in 2004. In my own state of Kerala, the CPM worked very hard against the Congress party, won most of the seats in Kerala, but when they came to Delhi in 2004, they supported the UPA government. So I am very confident that under various kinds of formulae, we should be able, realistically, to come and form a government in Delhi.
We shall leave him with that last word for now. And the next time round, at this very festival, you can tell us all about what happened. Thank you very much for being an amazing audience. And of course, thank you so much, Mr. Tharoor.
Thank you. It's a real honor. Now, it's time to felicitate Dr. Shashi Tharoor and Monideepa Banerjee. Monideepa Banerjee.